All right, thank you, Taylor. And just confirm that the presentation is visible. Okay, great. Awesome. Okay, great. I'm just getting set up here. So yeah, thanks for the introduction and thanks everyone for attending tonight's seminar. I have had the pleasure of doing this same topic a number of times throughout the course of the last couple of years in collaboration with Resource Central. And Taylor and I were just going over the number of attendees for tonight's webinar, and it's like 160, which is amazing. I think when I first started doing it, we had a couple dozen people who were interested specifically in this topic of HOAs, and it has just become more and more relevant in the discussion about water conservation, especially in Colorado. And some of that is because of the things that I'll talk about tonight, which is all the changing legislation that is applicable to homeowners associations and owners in those associations. So all that to say, thank you for attending. Thanks for your interest in this important topic. And we'll go ahead and get started here. So basically, the presentation is structured into four parts. The first is a little bit more context on really why homeowners associations matter for a Waterwise Colorado. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the HOA governance structure and give some basics in terms of how that is arranged and the different layers of compliance that are considered when you're looking at water conservation and landscaping in homeowners associations. Third, I'm going to talk about the approval process generally for what a Waterwise project or a landscape transformation project looks like. And then we'll do some projects tips and some summarizing thoughts and looking ahead into the future. So there's going to be a lot of information presented. I think the best way to go about making this as interactive and as helpful as possible for the attendees would be to use the Q&A feature in Zoom and just type your question in there as it comes up throughout the presentation. And if there's enough questions, I'll kind of monitor it as we go. If there's enough questions to take a pause and go through a specific issue with a little bit more detail, we could definitely do that. And there will certainly be time at the end to get to everyone's questions. So please put them in there and I'll try to do my best to answer all those. Okay, great. So just want to talk a little bit about the context, right? Why this topic matters and why we're seeing such a increase in interest in it. So if there's kind of one thing you take away from this section, it's that HOAs matter for this discussion, and they matter quite a bit. And the short answer to that is because there's a lot of them, and there's a lot of them in Colorado. So to zoom out a little bit, to give you a little bit of perspective, in the United States, in 1970, there were about 10,000 homeowners associations, which made up about 2.1 million people, residents, and that's about 1% of the US population at the time. If you fast forward about 50 years to the stats I pulled from 2019, that number has increased to 351,000 homeowners associations, totaling to 74 million residents, which is 22.5% of the nation's population lives under some form of a homeowners association. So that's almost a quarter of all residents in the US live under this type of governance structure. 2024, that number's just increased, so we might be a little bit higher than the 22%. Now, in Colorado, there is a high concentration of these types of communities. And for anyone that lives in the Front Range and is driven from Fort Collins down to Colorado Springs, definitely can see this just in the makeup of the urban landscape and some of the suburbs and developments that are sprawling out from the metro area. In total, we have over 10,000, and that makes up about 40% of Colorado's population, and it makes up 60% of homeowners in Colorado. If you look at the map there on the bottom left, you can see kind of a heat map of the concentration nationwide of homeowners associations among the general public. And you'll notice Colorado is one of the brightest colored states there, being at 40%. There's only two states that are higher in concentration. The first being Florida, which, if you're familiar with Florida, it's type of communities that we're talking about, that probably comes as no surprise. And then the only one that's higher is the wonderful state of Vermont in the Northeast there. And that's a little bit of a statistical anomaly because Vermont does not have a very large population. It's the 49th most populous state, so it doesn't nearly have the same impact. So all that to say is there are a lot of HOAs in Colorado, and it is where over 60% of the homeownership opportunities lie. Now you might be wondering, what is the purpose, the function, what are the benefits of these properties? And really it comes down to a couple key things, and it kind of depends on the lens you look at this through. But for this presentation, I would say the biggest thing is that it's all about, creating ownership opportunities for residents of the state. That has a lot of intrinsic value in terms of a strong economy, strong population, other metrics. There's also the benefit of having these properties have some layer of protection of value through the Homeowners Association, which is one of the purposes of these governance structures. Also, it's a very fast, efficient, and scalable way for home builders to come into a growing urban area and develop homes and other amenities like parks, walkways, streets, other facilities that might be a part of a neighborhood. Makes it a nice place to live. It's a very effective way to do that at scale. And so that's why a lot of the home builders and a lot of development has been friendly to these types of communities. So it's very widespread throughout the state of Colorado. However, 2/3 of the homeowners associations are already 20 years old. So that means that they were primarily built, in the end of the last millennium and into the 2000s. That's where the majority of the home building occurred. So the HOA model is here to stay. A lot of the new homes are also being developed under this model. And that's up to 67% in the Western United States are going this way. So it's really important that we understand the HOA's influence and how they can really be used as a tool for some of these sustainability and water conservation measures rather than always being seen as a roadblock. So that's kind of one of the big objectives of tonight. Okay, so the water conservation opportunity at the HOA level can be sort of categorized in two ways. The first is the common area landscaping. So this is the landscaping that makes up parks, streetscapes. We might have medians or other grassy areas throughout a community or a green belt. Those would be all areas that are considered common elements of the association. And the maintenance and the irrigation for these areas are covered by the association's annual operating budget. So they likely will hire a landscape company, a commercial landscape company to come in and service these areas throughout the summer, on a weekly basis. You'll see the landscaping crews out there. These areas are primarily responsible for the HOA board. They're the ones that make the decisions for what happens to these areas and if they want to be improvements or if they want to work on the sprinkler system or if they want to fund a project there. That's all done at the board level, so the board of directors. There's a huge opportunity for Waterwise landscaping on these types of areas, but today the focus is really going to be on the individual landscapes on private property, individual lots within a homeowners association. So these types of projects are initiated and paid for by the owner. So as the homeowner, you're the one that's financially responsible for the area and the maintenance. However, these areas are still subject to the association rules, and landscape retrofits must follow a process. And we're going to talk about what that process looks like quite a bit today, how those rules are applicable, and what some of the recent policy amendments have done to impact and to promote the more widespread use of water conservation and water-wise landscaping. So again, single family homes is the focus. Colorado homeowners have time and again shown their support for all things sustainability, really, but a particular focus for tonight on, water-wise landscaping and urban, suburban ecology. Again, the majority of homeownership opportunities in Colorado are within an owners association, so it makes sense for this to be an area that is of focus for the broader conversation around water. Many developments were built with a higher water demanding landscape. That was very common when Colorado went through that initial home building boom about 20 years ago when a lot of these communities were built. Typically, they included large lots and a lot of grass. That was just very common of the era. And the other reason tonight, and we'll get into this in the approval and review process, is that many owners are still somewhat uncertain of the review process in terms of what they can and can't do on their own lawn and how they can be in compliance with their HOA, and really to what level their HOA needs to be involved in that. So those are all things that we're going to talk about tonight as well. So to start, we're going to talk about kind of the who's who of the HOA, just to define some terms here. So I typically use the term HOA as kind of a catch-all, and a lot of other people in our industry do as well. The term stands for Homeowners Association. Legally, the term is probably more accurate to say common interest community. That is how it's defined by law. So you'll see all different acronyms thrown around. You'll also see PUD, which stands for Planned Unit Development, or CA, which just stands for Community Association. So there's all sorts of different names that people use, but ultimately what we're talking about is a community that is developed with a legal entity around the ownership of the real estate that has some authority that's defined in the governing documents of the association. Now, the members of the association would be the owners of that property within a common interest community. The membership is not voluntary. It is part of the ownership. It's tied to the ownership of the property itself, of the real estate. Therefore, the assessment of the fees is also mandatory. So when you purchase a property inside of a homeowners association, the annual budget and the association fees that you pay, those are not elective. Those are something that you must pay to be a member of the association. Now, the board of directors is another kind of important thing to understand. This is essentially the governing board of these communities, and these are elected owners who volunteer through a process described in the governing documents of the association to serve on that board. And there are typically a set of bylaws that those board members must follow as they make decisions for the community. At the end of the day, the board of directors, these volunteers who are also owners and perhaps residents of these communities, they are the ultimate decision makers for all affairs that occur at the HOA level. Then lastly, management company. This is where I come in. So management companies are the professional service providers that are contracted by the association boards to really facilitate all the affairs of the association. And that typically includes things like operations, financial management, and all of the other administrative duties that come along with that. Okay, so this slide here is intended to show just kind of a visual of what the governance hierarchy is of a homeowners association and how it is applicable to other pieces of law and legislation. And this is important for the following slides when we get into some of the amendments that have quite a bit of impact, especially as it relates to water conservation. So it's the boring stuff, but it'll get better in a couple slides. So at the very top, you have federal, state, and local laws. HOAs have their own set of rules, regulations, declarations. However, that is not ever above anything at the federal, state, and local level. So just to give a couple of examples, these are things like the Fair Housing Act, ADA, building codes, for example. These are all things that associations must be in compliance with. The next level down is a very pertinent piece of legislation that was passed through Colorado in 1992, which is called the Colorado Common Interest Ownership Act. And another acronym, we love them in our industry here, Kiowa for short. So you might hear people refer to Kiowa. This is the main body of legislation that governs common interest communities. So this includes condos as well as condo associations, as well as homeowners associations. Next down is the governing documents of the development. So this includes things like the declaration, the covenants, the codes, and the restrictions. That also includes the bylaws, which is more of the operating manual of how the board of directors and owners go about conducting the affairs of the association. It also includes the rules and regulations. So these are basically the things you can and can't do within a community, as well as the architectural guidelines, which will become relevant when we start talking about projects and stuff like that. And again, the purpose of the governing documents is going back to that property values to have a set of rules that are declared by law of how the community is going to handle itself, how it's going to maintain its assets. The other kind of objective of having these governing documents is to promote harmonious living and to preserve the common design and architectural integrity throughout the community. So there's some controls there that you can't completely remodel your home so that it is unrecognizable to the neighbors, and you can't do design things that would also impact the sort of continuity throughout the community. And these guidelines extend to both the common elements of the community as well as the individual property. So, although these communities are privatized, they're all still very regulated by some form here in the hierarchy, whether it's its own governing documents or if it's something that falls into the state, local, or the Kiowa Act. Okay, so there's a couple of really important milestones here when it comes to policy that have really impacted the ability for owners inside of an association to implement and initiate their own water conservation efforts. So again, Kiowa was passed in 1992, and from 92 until 2013, xeriscaping and Waterwise landscapes on individual owners' property was likely to be in violation of an association's architectural guidelines. And since it was likely to be in a violation, they would therefore be subject to enforcement, which could include fines, it could include warning letters or demands to change. All of those things are things that an association could do. So, really this is very open-ended and really depends on kind of, again, that board of directors, the management company who's making some of these decisions. There were probably a lot of projects that went through during that era before 2013 when the Senate bill was passed that probably was never a problem at their associations, but there were certainly some that were absolutely a problem in terms of being in violation of the governing documents and therefore people receiving fines and things like that for implementing these types of projects. So in 2013, this bill was passed at the Senate, which actually went back to Kiowa, the 1992 document, and amended it. And amongst several other things, including political, religious expression, fire prevention, renewable energy devices, it also included drought prevention measures, which includes specific definitions of what xeriscaping means, and therefore creates any prohibitions to those to be contrary to public policy and therefore not able to be enforced upon. So xeriscaping at that point was defined as the combined application of the 7 principles of landscape planning and design, soil analysis and improvement, hydrozoning of plants, practical turf areas, uses of mulch, irrigation efficiency, and appropriate maintenance. So it was a fairly broad definition that really opened up the door to a lot of these projects to be able to be implemented without the association having the ability to go and enforce any of its governing documents or design guidelines that may be in violation of. So this was really the big thing that happened back in 2013. So yes, just to kind of summarize, so any restrictive covenant, declaration, bylaw, rules, regulation, all of that would be contrary to the public policy, unenforceable. The association also may not place additional burdens, procedural or financial, on application and review. So if an owner did have a project that they wanted to apply for and go through the process of the review, the association wasn't allowed to assess an additional fee or a fine or implement any burdensome procedural things to potentially slow that review process down. Associations also must consider the watering restrictions before issuing fines for dying and unirrigated vegetation. So this would typically come from a water provider like Denver Water or City of Westminster or Aurora, any of the water providers in the area. The association would have to consider any restrictions that were in place. The one limitation of SB 13-183 was that associations may still uphold design and aesthetic guidelines, including the type, number, and placement of those proposed plantings. So this kind of comes back, a little bit later in the presentation, but that's the main problem with this bill was that it was still a little bit open-ended on what the association could uphold, and it wasn't defined well in terms of still uphold the design and aesthetic guidelines, including the type number. So there was still some ability for associations to say, well, I understand this is a xeriscaping project. However, we're going to limit the number of plants that you can put here, or we're going to limit the placement so that it's more compatible with the larger community. So there were still some things that associations could do, which proved to be somewhat problematic. Shortly after, or I'm sorry, more recently, there was another House bill that had some impact here, kind of piggybacking on the 2013 bill, and that essentially added non-vegetative turf grass or artificial turf to that definition of xeriscaping. So that allowed owners to go ahead and install, artificial turf as part of that as well. That did exclude anything in front yards, but you were able to do it in backyards. So that was another somewhat relevant, much smaller, but another piece of legislation that passed in 2021. Okay, so getting to a little bit more recently, and this is one of the reasons why I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation why this is, perhaps a topic with just growing interest year over year, because when I gave this presentation last year, this slide wasn't included. So this is brand new. When I gave the presentation around this time last year, SB 23-178 was just going through the process. There was a number of testimonials and things that were happening at the courthouse in terms of getting this bill passed. And this has a lot of impact on that specific part of the previous 2013 bill that I mentioned, which was still a little bit open-ended. So SB 23-178 further defines the extent that an HOA can uphold the aesthetic guideline, which includes that type and placement, which is a very important piece of this. So this was passed during last year's legislative session, and it has gone into effect as of August 9th this summer. So there's another really important piece of amendment here that has gone through. Essentially, the bill states that the association's guidelines must not require more than 20% hardscape, allowing options for at least 80% of the front yard to be drought tolerant. Also, associations may not prohibit the use of non-vegetative turf grass in the backyard and must not prohibit vegetable gardens in the front or side yards. So again, another piece kind of showing the trend of, all of these policy amendments, making this more and more encouraging for owners to go after these projects. And the neat thing about this bill is not only did it alleviate some of these restrictions by producing a little bit more clear definition of what those aesthetic guidelines are, but it also encourages the use of Waterwise landscape designs by permitting the installation of at least 3 pre-approved designs for the front yard xeriscaping conversion. So that's really neat to see. Not only are we alleviating the restrictions, but we're actually taking that next step and encouraging that. And the way that the legislators wrote that in is that those designs can be be pre-approved, so it makes the design review process a lot easier. And I think, are still in the process of defining, what type of organization can be part of that. But I believe at the time Resource Central was mentioned, Denver Botanical Gardens, Northern Water, I believe Denver Water, Aurora Water, some of our other big water providers in the area were on that list of you can use their pre-approved designs, which is really neat to see. And those designs are, this is stated in the bill, must adhere to the 7 principles of Waterwise landscaping. So that was really neat to see. All right, so I'm going to get into a little bit more of the nuts and bolts of kind of what the approval process looks like. Generally speaking, I'll give some examples of what that looks like if you're a homeowner and are interested in kind of moving through this with your own HOA. But let's take a quick break for a couple questions that came in. And if you have any other questions about kind of big picture, or any of the governance things, this would be a good time to ask those. If not, we can always come back to the end. So let's take a look at a couple of these.
Yeah, it looks like we have a question asking to clarify the difference between a hardscape versus a landscape.
Okay, yeah, so that would be defined as something that's impervious. So anything that has an impervious surface, so any like stone, flagstone, concrete, asphalt, those would all be considered impervious surfaces. So that basically means, if water does not be absorbed by it, if it runs off, then that would be considered a hardscape.
Okay, awesome. Another question is, do you have people that can come out and help the homeowner with specific ideas?
We don't specifically, my management company doesn't really provide those type of services, but there are a lot of different resources in the area that can perhaps help with that. As I mentioned, some of these pre-approved designs are readily available online, and that definitely helps kind of owners get an idea of what their front yard could look like through a landscape conversion. Of course, Resource has a lot of those resources available to owners. Other than that, you certainly can consider hiring professionals, so landscape designers or landscape contractors who will come out and specialize in this type of landscape conversion can absolutely help you kind of ideate on what you want to see out of the project.
Great. Another question is, does the state limit how much lawn can be converted to xeric anywhere on a property, or is it unlimited? Can 100% of the lawn be converted?
Yeah, it can be completely converted.
Sweet. 100%.
Yeah.
And then last question for now is someone stating that they asked their HOA about planting a Waterwise kit from Resource Central, and they said it had been reviewed by architectural review for approval. Is that correct in terms of these pre-approved designs?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll talk a little bit about what that approval process looks like moving forward. So this law, this SB 23-178, it's brand new. It just went into effect in August, which is pretty late for a xeriscaping project to get started. So I have a feeling that we haven't really stress tested the parameters of the law, and we just don't have a lot of experience yet. This summer, we'll learn a lot more about what that looks like. From what I understand, speaking with attorneys who specialize in association law, the pre-approved designs, once published in the governing documents or the updated rules and regulations of the association, once they're published in there, owners should be able to move forward those projects sort of separate than the approval process. But until that happens, they should still go through the normal approval process as you would, which I'll describe in detail just moving forward here, just to make sure that you're kind of covering all your bases. There's other things in the approval process that could be applicable to really any project, and those are things like, you know, working hours or parking restrictions or things like that that don't really matter for like what type of project's going on, but the committee or the board members want to see that you've applied for the project and that you've signed off on your responsibility as an owner to follow all of those rules. And some of those things are, things like allowing contractors into the community, or if there's a gated community, you might have to have some additional permissions granted, things like that. So if you miss out on some of those more logistical things, I could see there potentially being an issue down the road. So I would say err on the side of going through the whole process. It should be relatively easy to get the physical project approved, and then just make sure you're following the rules moving forward.
Great. And then I think we have just one last question before we move on. Where are those landscape designs being generated? I think the landscape designs we were referencing in the last question.
Yeah, so those landscape designs that are, considered pre-approved, all of the organizations that have developed those have taken their own approach. I mean, typically they consult with, architectural design professionals or landscape architects, horticulturalists, Plant Select, Audubon Society. There's a number of people that come from the sort of ecology worlds too. So it's definitely been, a collaborative effort in putting together these designs. Irrigation too is a big part of it, and irrigation considerations. So yeah, all that to say is I think each landscape design that would qualify for that pre-approved sort of has its own development story between who put it together. I know, like Resource Central, for example, I know you guys used landscape architects and have updated those throughout the years. And I think the other water providers have done something similar too.
Great, thanks. Okay, that is all of our questions for now, but feel free to keep putting questions into the Q&A and we will address them later.
Yeah, great questions, everyone. Thanks. So next, I wanted to just talk a little bit about the sort of approval process, that if you're an owner, this is kind of what you'd expect, and give you some tips on how to go about this. So more acronyms. So Architectural Review Committee, ARC, also known as Design Review Committee, Architectural Committee, DRC, ARC, et cetera, et cetera. So there are a lot of different names for this committee in this process, and it varies across the board in terms of what it is by name. At the end of the day, they're all pretty much the same. There's a process outlined somewhere in the governing documents of the association, which describes what this process looks like in terms of an owner submitting an application for review to make some sort of change or alteration to the property. Oftentimes there is a committee involved in this. So a committee is essentially an extension of the board of directors. So a committee, again, is typically made up of volunteers, owners of the community who want to serve, and help out with this aspect of management. The committee's purpose is really to oversee the sort of procedure as described in those governing documents. So sometimes there is a specific charter that says this is exactly what the committee is going to do. Other times it's written in the bylaws or the declaration, but there's typically some governing document that it tracks back to. And again, these people, their purpose is to review and then ultimately approve these applications. So the review process, really, it should be described somewhere again. So if you're an owner, I would recommend trying to find out where this exists in your governing documents. It might be really simple. You might have to do a little bit of digging. You can definitely ask a board member or representative of your management company should be able to help you figure out where that exists. But the review process should be listed out in detail, and it should tell you what the application looks like. It should tell you what the review process looks like, and it oftentimes will include timelines for approval. Obviously, the more clear and concise and updated the guidelines are, the more helpful this is for owners who are going about a project like that. So if there are any board members or committee members on the call tonight, you might think about putting together, kind of a cheat sheet or something like that, or actually going as far as to kind of amending these documents so that owners understand where they are and not packed into the declaration where no one's ever going to read it. So you want this stuff to be visible. the review process does require some interpretation of those design and aesthetic guidelines. Again, those definitions that were amended in the policy that I talked about. Those definitely help with that interpretation, but there is still some open-endedness there. And these are volunteers who are, ultimately looking out for the best interests of the association. And sometimes that interpretation does require additional help, mostly in the form of associations' legal counsel, to really interpret and enforce what those guidelines say and what the committee should be directing the owners to do, or something that they can't do. So I kind of have a three-step process outlined here for owners, and this is all super general. It might be applicable to your situation and your owners association. Some things might not be, but in general, I would say you kind of want to start with a project planning phase if you're considering a project this spring. You want to look at sort of your budget, the scope of what you're trying to do. You want to start thinking generally about kind of what the plant selections, what colors you want to kind of bring into the new plantings as they go through the season and mature. You want to think about the aesthetics, how it kind of fits into your home and the design you have with the facade, all of that. You'll definitely want to think about your irrigation system. This is often one of the easy things to forget, is the stuff that's buried in the ground, especially for cost. If you're retrofitting your irrigation system heavily, that can really add to the cost of a landscape renovation project. So definitely think about that. If, to what level you need to retrofit. Can you add in drips, sprinkler irrigation easily, or is there going to be more extensive effort that can have a really big impact? And then lastly, you also want to consider the level of maintenance required moving forward. So I would imagine most people that are on the call tonight are somewhat interested or familiar with this type of landscaping, but it is much different than, a regular lawnmower and a trimmer. It requires kind of a different level of service on different frequency. There's there's a lot more seasonal tasks involved with it too. Some different maintenance things, and you'll just want to think about what that looks like for you moving forward. Are you going to be performing that yourself? Are you going to have to find a new gardener, a new landscaper who's going to come and do that for you? Wouldn't be too early to start thinking about that. And this is kind of, again, your projects team, your resources. You want to think about, are you going to be doing the bulk of the labor? Are you going to be hiring people to do it? Are you going to be taking advantage of some of these free designs and working them into your yard? Or do you want to really start from scratch with a landscape designer or an architect? You'll want to think about, again, the contractor for the installation. Is that going to be the same person who's going to maintain it moving forward? There are a lot of contractors now who specialize just in this type of project in the area, which is great. So there's a lot of resources available to you. And then in terms of the review process, you want to think about kind of who you need and what documents you'll need from who in terms of putting that application together. Are you going to need schematics? Are you going to need an actual landscape design from an architect? To what level are you going to need to provide documentation for this project to be approved? And then you want to think about your initial design and kind of your first draft. You want to kind of get these ideas down on paper. Think about your schedule. Are you going to be doing it this summer? Is this the next summer project? Generally what type of schedule you have for installation, and start thinking about that now. Okay, so the second step is more administrative, requiring the completing the application and then putting that in for approval. So first thing first, I would say familiarize yourself with the process. So if you don't have clear guidelines in terms of what that process looks like for your association, I would request that information from your management company, or from a board member, whoever might be a resource that can help you on the board and management side, so that you can get an idea of what the required documents are, and also what the timeline for review is. If an association board is only meeting quarterly and they don't review these applications as they come in, and they wait until they all come in and then they review them at a meeting, that's probably really important for you to know in terms of when you're going to do your project and when you might receive approval for it. The language and the guidelines, again, you'll just want to be really familiar with that and make sure that your plans, speak to anything thing that is specifically mentioned in those guidelines. So if you have like specific plants that are an approved list of trees, things like that, you'll want to make sure that you address that in your plans. And then you'll want to work towards kind of finalizing and submitting that application. Always having like kind of a short little cover letter intro to your application is helpful. Contact information of who they can call or get in touch with if we need more information. Include as much detail as you can. So if you have those detailed plans, if you have plant lists, definitely include that in your initial application. Include qualifications, include contractors if you're using them, name and number. If you worked with like an estimator who's available to take calls, include his name, her name. And then you'll want to also provide sort of a general construction schedule too, which gives the board or potentially the committee an idea of when you're looking to do the project. And then you'll want to consider some of the other things too, like I mentioned, parking, work hours, et cetera. Those are all things that can impact, what your project looks like and ultimately its success. In terms of actually submitting this, there's a number of different ways that management companies are intaking these. Should it again be available to you? Took a quick screenshot of what ours looks like. This is a screenshot of our online portal. So this is something that all of our owners have access to, and including, the ability for them to make payments to their normal HOA dues, make a maintenance request. There's also a tab for architectural reviews. And this is how we intake all of our architectural reviews that come in and essentially put in the info, describe the project, add all the files, then it submits, and then it goes into the queue for review. So you'll just want to make sure that, you have all of this stuff figured out kind of before you get into really scheduling it out, because the review process can take some time. And again, always more information up front is better. Okay, so yeah, as I mentioned, sometimes a committee or management team might need more information about the project, in which case they'll reach back out and ask for details. Once you do receive approval, I would recommend always keeping, your documentation organized. So keep that initial application saved, keep your approval, all of that saved, and do a good job of hanging on to that should you need it later down the road. Once it is approved, you want to notify the management of your installation schedule. It may not be totally necessary depending on your community, but again, if you have things like a gated community, or if you have limited parking, or if you have any requirements that include you notifying management or the board of contractors on the property, things like that, you want to make sure that everyone's kind of in the loop there. And then during and after the installation, you'll want to be sure that any potential changes to your project, as described in your plans, are not material changes to what was approved. So if you have an approval and then the project changes quite a bit from the time it was approved to the time it is installed, you'll just want to make sure that you either seek additional approval or ask additional questions if your project is changing a lot, because you won't want your project to sort of be in violation if you did something that wasn't in the approved plans. So in most cases, people are pretty generous here once you've gone through the process, and as long as it's a small change, then it shouldn't be a problem. But if you decide you were doing kind of one scope of project and then that moved into a lot bigger scope, you'll definitely want to consider that. And then some governing documents I've seen do require the owner to notify a management company or their board of completion and to actually schedule an inspection afterwards. So if that is a step in your process, just make sure that it is handled and that's done at the end of the project and you get that sign off. Again, in terms of documentation, that's a really important piece to make sure you have on file. Okay, great. So it looks like a bunch of questions came in. So let's try these and then we'll kind of get into the last bit here.
Yeah, sounds good. So we have a question about mentioning the sustainable landscape templates, which were designed by Northern Water, as one of those, kind of how you listed some of those pre-approved designs. Are you familiar with that template resource?
I'm not familiar with it. I just listed off the ones that were kind of top of mind. I believe I can look at the at the law that was passed, and it is interesting to see how they defined those pre-approved designs, but I believe any water provider is identified as a source of a pre-approved design. So if Northern Water produced a bunch, great resource. I would absolutely take advantage of that.
Sweet. And we had a seminar about that one as well. I think our recording is on YouTube, so that's a good resource as well. Another question is asking about best practices for the composition of the design review committee of an HOA. Should it be just the board, volunteers, a combination of?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what I've seen most effective is having one board member, or at least one board member who's sort of like the chair, liaison of the committee. And then it's a great opportunity to include some other people in the community that might not have the availability to sit on the board and do the normal day-to-day business of an association, which can be quite a lot. But opens up some other opportunities for people who might be passionate or have professional experience in this area. But what I've seen work really well is having at least one board member to be on that committee as well too. And then the two parties are just working in a little bit better coordination than if they were a completely separate committee. So having a little bit of overlap is really helpful.
Great, thanks. Another question is asking about this presentation is very oriented towards making changes to limited common elements like your individual property. Do you have any tips for owners who would like to get common areas to be more water-wise?
Yeah, great question. And you're correct. This presentation is really focused mostly on, single family homes, owners that want to do these types of projects on their own property. Again, huge opportunity for common area landscaping conversions, big green belts, medians, entryways, parks. There's a huge opportunity with large HOAs that have these vast swaths of Kentucky bluegrass, and I've worked with a lot of communities that have just huge operating budgets just for water and irrigation, so it's absolutely relevant. I would say the biggest thing for that is going back to our kind of governance hierarchy in the who's who. The HOA board is really the decision maker in terms of how those areas are maintained and if they're retrofitted. And what a project like that would look like is all done through the HOA board level. So that is that's kind of the short answer. The long answer is that you could again develop, a board could develop a committee. Perhaps it's called a Waterwise committee or something like that, as a way to include other to include other residents or volunteers who could help with that. Suffice to say, there's if you're considering a large project, there's a lot of planning and and design and all that stuff is all applicable just at a bigger scale. So having the right people involved is one of the critical things to see success there.
Yeah, and there's a follow-up to that question. Someone stating that their HOA got a Northern Colorado Water Conservation grant that matched up to 20,000 for reworking areas of xeriscaping. So asking if you know any specifics about this or other examples like this.
Yeah, that's great. And thanks for pointing that out. There are Yeah, in the last several years, there's been more and more attention on providing resources, especially financial resources, to homeowners associations to make some of these conversions. I think Northern Water has probably been the most prominent program in terms of like available funding for that. I know a lot of water providers. I mean, it's hard to keep track of because it's been things change on a year-to-year basis, but I know for certain years Aurora Water had a lot of rebates, and so depending on your water provider, sometimes there's a lot of incentives there that can be helpful. And not only just for the the actual xeriscaping efforts, but for some of the more preliminary efforts too, like conducting a an irrigation audit, for example, is another one that's almost all the water providers in the area, that at least all the ones that Resource Central works with, have some incentives there. So those are really good preliminary steps too.
Yeah, similar to that, auditing for water use is, do you have any recommended tools for estimating the water savings for converting common areas to Waterwise?
Yeah, though, well, that's a great question and is a big part of kind of moving the discussion along, especially at the HOA level, right? Because as someone else mentioned, the irrigation audits, money well spent. Like homeowner associations pay for all the water. I mean, those are where your dues are going. And, typically I'll say commercial landscapers they'll err on the side of watering more than less, right? That's just kind of the reality of it, because typically they want to keep the areas that they're maintaining looking healthy and green and all of that. So, as such, we can see some very large bills during a summer on what that takes to maintain. In terms of tools for actually estimating, what some of those water savings can be, you're probably best by looking at a square foot basis, and just getting like real general numbers in terms of how much water Kentucky bluegrass requires per square foot versus a square foot of xeriscaping, and then extrapolating that out over the area that you're considering. That's going to be kind of the most high level way to do it. There's a lot of additional details that would be relevant to actually figuring that out. But at a high level, I would start with the square footage model and go from there.
Great. And someone made a comment about Northern Water having some really good information that they're able to use to estimate those sort of water usage for their grant process. So that's another great resource. I
Great.
think our last question here is, what specifically may HOAs kind of use as their reasoning for rejection in terms of turf replacement?
Yeah. Let's hang on to that one because it'll be kind of relevant in the looking ahead section. So yeah, great.
Perfect.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Okay, wonderful. So yeah, just a couple of tips going back to the ARC process, just to kind of summarize. So, understanding your HOA's process and the guidelines ahead of time, that will continue to do you favors throughout the process. Again, request that application information from management or the association or the board, whoever you can figure out is kind of the keeper of that, and learning about that application early on, super helpful. First time in submitting the application, just try to provide as much information as you can. For sure, being clear, concise is all going to help you move through that process just much easier, and will give the volunteers the right information they need to make their decision. Consider seasonal timing. So, again, if you find out that the management company or the association has like a 60-day turnaround on, reviewing and providing approval for these projects, that can be, kind of make or break your project for a summer or not. So you want to make sure that you kind of have a good idea of what that looks like and what the expectations are in terms of approval, so you can start to schedule that out through the spring and summer. One thing I wanted to talk about just real quick is, don't worry about the questionable precedents or the Joneses. So one thing in homeowners associations, there's always a revolving door in terms of who's in these positions, whether you're a board member or a management company or an account representative of a management company. There's always going to be some turnover there. And I've worked with a lot of board members who have been on boards for years and decades with some, and that's a really special thing because they hold a lot of institutional knowledge. But I've worked with other boards that have an election every other year or whatever it is, and there's a whole new makeup. Those again are the people that are making the decisions on these projects, whether it's them or the committee members. And I'll just say sometimes things are granted approval that probably shouldn't have had approval, and that's just kind of the reality of our industry. And that can be hard when you see your neighbor with a project that perhaps should not have been approved or whatever it might be. So it's hard to compare yourself to those, and especially things that have happened in the past. I would just say try to stay focused on understanding the current guidelines, working with the people that are there, and making sure your project is compliant. And then the last thing I just wanted to say is, for those on the call that might be board members or might be part of these committees, your guidelines can always be improved, right? You can go through and put together an effort on amending them, making them clearer, making them compliant with the new laws that have just passed. Those are all things that can be done to the guidelines. So just because they exist right now as your governing documents, that doesn't mean that they can't be improved or changed upon. Now, it is quite a bit of work to go through that process, and sometimes it does require approval from owners in order to make amendments. But in a lot of cases, that makes a lot of sense to do. So if you live in an older community with just very outdated guidelines in terms of the rules and regulations or the aesthetic guidelines, it could be a very worthwhile effort to go through and put together some proposed amendments and improvements to those. Okay, so wanted to provide a couple of examples from real governing documents. These are governing documents for Colorado HOAs, and just going to use this to demonstrate a couple of key points. So, this example right here at the top, this is talking about the association review period. So this would be really important for an owner to understand that this association here has an ARC that will approve or disapprove all applications within 45 days after submission. So, 45 days, that's a month and a half. If you're trying to squeeze your project in to a tight window there, you want to make sure that you've understood this and, gotten your application in ahead of time so that you're not in an inopportune time of year to actually go to install. Approval from another applicable HOA. This is a fairly common situation in Colorado communities to have what's called a master association and a sub-association. So in this case, if you have a sub HOA and a master HOA, it's probably likely that you'll need approval from both entities. And oftentimes the way that their governing documents are written, you probably won't need to redo your application. Probably one application would be fine for both of them. They're usually pretty consistent. However, you'll want to make sure that you don't forget that you need approval from both your master and your sub HOA, because that could get you into trouble later. This is an example of a community that has that inspection of work. Again, not every community has this, but if you do have it, make sure that this is a step that you don't miss. This one is the inspection shall terminate after 60 days. So if no one comes to inspect, I guess you get the sort of automatic approval. But if you do need the inspection to sign off, I would go ahead and try to schedule that with the right people and so that you can get that. This area here, maintenance and drainage, highlighted in red, because this is the one area that I've seen there be the most contest in. And although we talked about the new bill 2023 in terms of it really limiting how the governing documents are interpreted in terms of the design and aesthetic guidelines, this is something where you get into drainage and flow of water that falls outside of design and aesthetic guidelines. And this is really more of like a civil engineering or drainage pattern analysis. And in some cases, typically on bigger properties, if there is a complete overhaul of topography and various surfaces, whether they be impervious or they be pervious, also it has to do with like plant makeup and material and trees, that can have quite a bit of impact on how water might move through a property, which has no regard for where your community's property lines are drawn. So this is the one area that I would be just careful of if you're doing a big project that might have impact or potential impact on an adjacent lot. This would be something that a review committee might flag as needing a little bit extra analysis, or they may need a little bit of extra help from a professional who maybe you've already hired in terms of making sure that it's not going to affect the drainage in a way that's detrimental to adjacent properties. So that's the one thing that I've seen this really get kind of messy on is drainage. So keep that in mind. Then going back to the landscape design standards, this is just an example of those specifics. This one's actually Lowry. I think this is Lowry Master. This is talking about, specific trees that are prohibited, right? So you want to make sure that you're in compliance with any prohibited trees or other plants. This one, evaluation of design criteria. Again, just materials, installation methods must be appropriate, integrates well with existing landscape, reasonably conforms. So that gives you an idea of kind of, what the people are looking at or what they're sort of tasked to uphold. And then some other things that are required for the application. So site plans, concept sketches, list of plant material. These are all things that if you were applying in this community, you'd want to provide up front so that you have all the information over as necessary and hopefully get a quick approval. And then lastly, just wanted to point out, this is from another community. I can't remember, I think this might be the Park Hill neighborhood, but this is about, it's an old community. This was early 2000s was when it was written, but you can kind of see the fingerprints of what was to come. This set of governing documents actually highlighted planting concepts that would minimize water consumption and xeriscape is encouraged. So that was actually written right into the governing documents. They say, please refer to Denver Water publication. So again, this is like a 20-year-old community, but you can see that the interest was there even back then. So kind of neat. Okay, so back to the turf thing. So again, just reinforcing why this is such an important topic. So I barely had enough time to put together this slide for the presentation because this is a new law that just went into effect. Well, it was just signed on March 15th of 2024, and it will go into effect in a couple of years. And this new law is a statewide ban on non-functional turf, artificial turf, and invasive plant species. So Polis signed this, and I guess the key thing is understanding what non-functional turf is. And in order to do that, in the bill, it's kind of listed as, it's rather funny. It says non-functional turf is not functional turf. So functional turf is described as a space that is regularly used for civic, community, recreational purposes, which may include playgrounds, portions of parks, sports fields, that type of thing. What is considered non-functional turf, therefore, would be things like entryways, areas of parks that don't have recreation fields, medians, green belts, that sort of thing could all be potentially considered non-functional turf. And the scope of this law is applicable to commercial developments, institutional and industrial properties. And it's also applicable to common interest communities. So back to Kiowa, common interest communities, any land or property that is owned and maintained by an association. So these would be all those common areas that we talked about before. Now, you might be wondering, my HOA has a ton of grass, right? What are we going to do in 2026? Well, they're not requiring an immediate removal of any grass. The HOAs can maintain existing non-functional turf as it exists today if it's installed before this date. Any new developments, so any new homeowners association or commercial, institutional, industrial property will need to comply with this. So they won't be able to install any non-functional turf. The kind of key point here for HOAs is this redevelopment. So in practice, anything that is going through a redevelopment will also need to comply with this. So if the association has plans to, completely overhaul its common area landscaping to the extent that it would require a landscaping permit, then it would need to comply with this. So if it goes to permit, through the building department, through whatever jurisdiction it is in, and this will be flagged, an application will be flagged to be in compliance with this. So all of the non-functional turf will be analyzed at that point. So again, just kind of, this is representative of, how quickly this conversation has moved. If you look at, Kiowa being in 1992, there really wasn't anything until 2013. And then from 2013, that was, somewhat effective for about 10 years. And then the 2023 bill followed with the 2024. This has major, major impact and will really move the needle on the water consumption of the homeowners associations in Colorado. So, so it's really neat to see. Okay, so that's kind of the conclusion here. Those are my kind of concluding thoughts. Obviously, we have plenty of time for questions, so feel free to hit the Q&A feature there. I just kind of typed in some of the common questions that I hear. These are some of the things that might help you, figure out a good question to ask if you have anything for me. So let's go ahead and get into these and see what people have.
Yeah, sounds good. So you definitely touched on the HOA rejection of turf replacement. Until we get to that 2026 marker, what kind of things could you see as a HOA rejecting those lawn replacement projects?
Yeah, so in my experience, typically the homeowners associations are not rejecting the projects in principle, and usually not because of some violation of an aesthetic continuity or anything like that. Typically, these projects, I mean, the ones that have been, not approved, there's usually something else happening. Like I said, that drainage one is the single biggest one that I've seen that has become legal. The other things that I've seen is just like that owners may not understand the process. They may not understand that, you need the 45-day lead time, or that you have to have all the documents. So I've seen the majority of these rejected are not because they're xeriscaping projects. They could be anything. They're just not following the process in a way that allows this committee or the board to make that approval, or they may not have all the information to make that approval. So that's really the biggest piece of it. I haven't seen many boards, just on principle rejecting these things. That's not really what I've seen at all. It's more so been an administrative barrier.
Gotcha. All right. And then we have a question about legal verbiage that could possibly prevent harvesting rainwater in terms of micrograding.
That's a great question. I haven't seen anything on that. I know this new bill, it doesn't really affect, or it's not really tied to any of the rainwater harvesting language, and I don't think is referenced in it at all.
Okay, gotcha. All right, then talking about artificial turf installation, does this new law prohibit schools from installing artificial turf? Because there's several schools in this person's community with artificial turf, and it may be cheaper to maintain.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I don't know what type of like alternative compliance there might be for scenarios like that. And I'm not sure. I mean, again, we'll learn as this goes into practice. I think not an expert in law, not an expert in, schools or anything like that. I'm strictly the HOA guy. But I mean, as the law reads, it would hypothetically be applicable to a school, because that includes the commercial, institutional, industrial property. So, yeah, I'm not sure how that's gonna roll out and what impact it's gonna have.
Yeah, we'll see. Similar to that, we're asking that same kind of question about artificial turf when it comes to city and municipal parks, parks and rec areas. So I'm guessing that'll be the same thing. We kind of go with the flow and see what happens for this one.
Yeah, again, I'm not totally sure how that's gonna apply, at the municipal level. Yeah, I'm not sure.
All right,
It's
we'll
brand
see.
new. Yeah.
All right, and last question that's on here for now, could you re-explain non-functional turf and not allowed to use artificial turf?
Yeah, so the non-functional turf, again, would be anything that is not a space used for civic, community, or recreational purposes, which, and the law lists this out. There's a longer list. You can look it up very easily if you wanted to see it. It's SP 24-005. And there's a bunch of news articles written about it since it's so recent. But yeah, that, includes playgrounds, portions of parks, sports fields, et cetera, is all considered functional turf. So non-functional turf is anything that's not that. So kind of open-ended. But in general, I think what the policymakers are trying to go for are, entryways around monuments. And this is specifically to homeowners associations, entryways around monuments, to where, people aren't going out there having a picnic, right? It's not used in a way that's recreational in any nature. It's specifically for the aesthetic appeal. Medians, right? So areas like in between, streets where again, no one's enjoying that grass other than visually, so non-functional. Those small strips along sidewalks, things like that, that would all be considered non-functional.
Awesome. Well, that was our last question on here. Last call for questions. If you have anything, feel free to drop it in the Q&A.
All right. Well, thanks for all the great questions, everyone, and thanks for your attendance. Yeah, as I mentioned, it's a great topic. There's a lot of movement on it at the policy level. So we'll see how all this stuff starts to work in practice with all the changes. Thanks again, Resource Central. I'm happy to do this every year. I look forward to it. So thank you guys for hosting it. And I think your sponsor was Westminster this session. So thank you all. It's Westminster and all the other water providers you guys work with. This is great to support these events. If you guys have any questions for me, HOA related things, feel free to reach out. My contact information's here. You can visit our website or reach out on LinkedIn is a good place to get in touch with me. So thanks, everyone.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Chris. I learned a lot about HOAs. I hope you guys did too, and can make your guys' process a little bit smoother going forward with any changes you guys make on your property. Thank you all for attending, and thank you to City of Westminster for making this seminar possible. Our seminar series this year will run through August, so be sure to sign up for other seminars on our website. When you exit the webinar today, you will get a survey link pop up. If you have a moment to fill that out, we'd really appreciate it. Otherwise, keep an eye out for an email tomorrow that'll have some more follow-up resources, another link to the survey, and a link to the recording of tonight's webinar. We value your feedback, so please take a moment to fill it out. Thanks again, everyone, and have a good evening.